only 5 or 6 missiles. Do you think that Shamir will sit tight?
I think Israel will be sorely tempted to attack, and I think Israel may well bend to American pressure and advice to sit tight, because after all, Israel, as I said earlier in the program, Israel is so well aware of what the dangers of an Israeli retaliation are, and because the injuries were so low, because chemical weapons were not used, I think it falls into that gray area where it depends on how many missiles were fired, how much damage there is, how many dead. It appears there are no dead and only 7 slightly wounded. I think there's a good chance Israel will not retaliate, it's my bet.
There is no more vigorous politics in the world than in the country from which you report, Israel, of course. Has there been a kind of
coalition that produced a successful vote for George Bush, the resolution authorizing him to use force? Tonight, obviously, we've heard conflicting reports, but now it appears that there was not chemical weapons. Would you expect, though, that this has crossed the threshold and that Israel would be retaliating?
I do, Andrea. I think the Iraqi attack against Israel was to be expected. And I think an Israeli retaliation against Iraq is to be expected. I also believe that we should expect the coalition will hold together. Both Saudi Arabia and Egypt recognize that they face a far more serious threat from Iraq than from Israel, and they're much more concerned about Saddam than about Shamir. In the case of Syria, the Syrians were not in any case participating in the air campaign, and it was always questionable whether they would participate in a ground campaign if there is even a need for one. So I don't think that this will result in the unraveling of the coalition.
Just to make the argument that some people in the Bush administration might be making, is there any way that you think Israel would be persuaded not to retaliate if these were conventional weapons and if the loss of life were minimum?
Israel permitted itself to be persuaded
just a quick answer.
Not to launch a preemptive attack against Iraq. I do not believe they can reasonably be expected not to strike back after having been attacked in population centers by Iraqi missiles.
Okay. Thank you, Congressman Solar's Tom.
Thanks very much. NBC News has learned that 6 Scud missiles either are heading for or have been launched at Saudi Arabia from Iraq. We do not know any additional information. NBC's Mike Betcher is at Dhahran right now. Mike, any more air raid sirens there?
Nothing, Tom. It's quiet. There has been very little activity on the air base here. It's interesting. I think that the alarm system lags behind the actual launch of missiles, if indeed they are occurring. Today, when we heard that, or this evening, when we heard the bang, the alarm came on, about 5 minutes after. So we're trying to get confirmation on the ground here, but we can't reach anyone to do that at the present time. So it is all quiet here. There have been no alarms, and we'll stand by, Tom, until we feel that we should head down to the basement.
All right, Mike Betcher, we are told that our source for this are high-ranking coalition officials. That's as precise as we can be. They have been highly reliable in the past, and we are told that either 6 Scud missiles are heading for Saudi Arabia or have already hit in Saudi Arabia, as I understand it. Let me just see if I can pick up something here on my computer. That's what we've been told. We do know that one missile that was launched at Dhahran was shot down by a Patriot missile, which is based there. The Patriot missiles were the anti-missile missiles. They had not been used, as Fred Francis pointed out, in combat before, and they were among the first units that were put in place because there were very grave fears early on when the United States first put Desert Shield in place that maybe there would be a preemptive strike from Saddam Hussein, and especially that there might be a chemical weapon of some kind or another. Gary Sick, as you look at the play of forces here tonight, it's pretty fluid at the moment. What can we anticipate next?
Well,
Steve Solar says that they're going to attack, by the way.
We talked several hours ago that it would take 2 or 3 hours for another flight of missiles to come out, and now what we're seeing is 3 hours later, almost exactly, another flight of missiles. So I don't know whether that really means anything or not, but it suggests that this is an ongoing thing and that those missile sites, wherever they were not silenced the first time around, but are now beginning to make themselves felt once more. So we may be in for a siege. My guess would be that this is kind of a guerrilla warfare as compared to the major warfare that we had anticipated. It's not 75 missiles coming in. It's a handful here and there. It's Iraq fighting in a highly wounded state. Iraq has been crippled, very badly crippled, and I think what they're doing, these are little spasms that we're getting from them, and presumably that's going to go on for some time.
It is not what you would call a very substantial counterattack, if that's what it is. 6 at Tel Aviv, 6 or 7 at Saudi Arabia. I mean, for the people who are in the path of those missiles, it's terrible peril, but in the larger scheme of things, it is not.
No, it's symbolic, and it's basically to make Saddam's point that he is not going to go down without a fight, but in fact it's a pitiful example.
Yeah.
I mean, he fired more missiles than that against Tehran every hour on the hour for weeks on end. So this is a very, very minor thing in light of what he had to operate with.
We're still awaiting any kind of an official assessment of the damage that has been done so far. Chemical weapons into Tel Aviv, despite earlier reports.
So, you know, the chemical thing, as somebody mentioned earlier, the fact that Saddam Hussein has chemicals and warheads does not mean that he has chemical warheads. And it has never been proved, and I was very interested to hear Fred say that earlier, that it never has been absolutely established. This would have been the first confirmation that they've managed to do all of the fusing, the complex work that has to be done to put that in a warhead.
Kerry Sick, we're going to ask you to stay in place, and all of our correspondents around the world as we continue our coverage of America at War, Operation Desert Storm. We'll be back right after this.
The liberation of Kuwait has begun.
I'm hopeful that this fighting will not go on for long.
We're in the very early stages of this operation.
Here it comes now, Tom. There's a very big bang right out the western side of the city. And now guns, there you go. You can hear that, Tom. There are guns, and there's more explosions on the western edge of the city. There's red tracer, white tracer. It's going up all over the place.
Sirens are still going. Let's listen. As many of you folks as you can should head to the shelter now.
Mike, get Arthur Kent to run up to the Joint Information Bureau. Get Arthur Kent to find out if we just lost Saudi Arabia. That's not an encouraging sign.
On the first wave that went up to Baghdad area last night, took off at 1:30. When he blew up, I could see a piece of the airplane blowing up. Obviously, it was at night. I couldn't see if a parachute or anything like that. It's a huge fireball. I don't anticipate anybody getting out of that.
We've now flown over 1,000 air sorties in the first 14 hours of the operation. There's been a single American aircraft lost and one British aircraft lost as well.
This was tremendous. Baghdad was lit up like a Christmas tree.
We're just hearing more explosions, which we assume are more missiles. Our cameraman on the way to the scene of the first explosions is telling us right now that as he's driving along, he's hearing more explosions. I cannot confirm a missile in Jerusalem, but we can certainly confirm at least 2 missiles having fallen near our offices here in a suburb of Tel Aviv. Israel's certain priority will be to go to find those missile sites and stop any more attacks. That's what they promised. Then it becomes a matter of, will Israel join the war?
Decisions will be made about going back to restrike those targets that require additional attention.
From NBC News, America at War continues. Here is Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. Operation Desert Storm has been underway for 28 hours now, and there have been many dramatic developments just this evening. Scud missiles have been launched at Israel. 5 or 6 landed in Tel Aviv. Initially, there were reports that one of the warheads may have contained nerve gas. That proved not to be true. Casualties, it turns out, are light. We are now awaiting the decision of the Israeli government, which may have already been taken, that decision, as to whether or not to launch a retaliatory strike against Iraq. This is vitally important from a political point of view because Saddam Hussein hopes that by luring Israel into the war, he'll break up.
And they're under it that it looks ineffectual. They could do a really devastating attack in order to show that it's extremely dangerous to touch them. But then they run the risk that Saddam will achieve his objective and turn it into an Arab-Israeli conflict. So I can understand it if they feel they must respond for moral reasons. If they do, I hope they will be very restrained in this first round.
What does that mean? Hitting a missile site with another missile?
Using missiles not overfly Jordan. Hitting some clearly military target with missiles would be my preferred approach. But one has to understand also another thing, that the reason Saddam can get away with, can even think of getting away with this, is because he believes that there is enough of a party of opinion in enough of the Arab world that so hates Israel that even a totally unprovoked attack against which Israel retaliates will bring that group on the side of Saddam, and so that the peace process is more complicated than people often present.
Besides the Israeli factor, you're the President of the United States tonight, or Jim Baker, or Brent Scowcroft. You've been in those positions. You haven't been president, but you've been sitting there in the crisis room. What would be your greatest concern at this hour, given what you know?
Well, my greatest concern would be not to be driven off course from what looks to me like an extremely successful operation, which is well planned, which will achieve our objectives, which will remove Iraq as the overhanging military threat of the area. And so I would just check all the bases to make sure that we're still on course, and try to convey the impression that we know what we're doing. And this is a blip. This is not an important event from a military point of view. Iraq has been under attack for 24 hours and has managed to launch 6 missiles against a country that wasn't part of the operation.
Are you struck by that? Are you surprised?
That the response has been so feeble?
Yeah.
Yes. I can't understand Saddam Hussein. I don't know why he didn't settle on.
Do you know anyone who does understand?
Really, it's a puzzle.
Yeah.
And but if we keep on the course on which we are, which the president has launched, we will prevail in fairly short order.
All right, let's say we prevail exactly under the terms that the president set out to prevail on. He's been telling everyone we'll get American troops home very swiftly. Is that realistic?
Absolutely. I think the big problem with all the so-called diplomatic solutions before this war was that as long as Saddam Hussein's military strength was unimpaired, we had the dilemma of either staying there indefinitely, which we shouldn't do, or going home and leaving a big vacuum. Now, after this military operation is completed, there'll be a pretty good balance between the moderate Arabs and what's left of the Iraqi military forces. And I think we can leave, and we should leave with our ground forces.
Dr. Henry Kissinger, thanks very much for being with us tonight. Appreciate it. Let's go to the White House now. NBC's John Cochran is monitoring the activities of President Bush at this hour. John?
I think the most important activities out of here have been what Secretary of State Baker has been doing. He's been on the phone to both Israeli officials, as John Dancy reported earlier, and also to Arab diplomats. We don't know exactly what he's being told. The Israelis apparently have not told the United States that they have launched an attack yet. But what we're not sure about is whether the Israelis have said they're not going to launch an attack. And of course, the Arab nations, I think Jim Baker has been trying to reassure them in some ways. So that's been the main activity out of here, and there is still a lot of nervousness about what the Israelis are going to do. I was just talking to somebody who said, we just don't know for sure.
Do they have any kind of a threshold worked out, or did Yitzhak Shamir say to Lawrence Eagleburger, listen, thanks very much for your advice and for your offer of help, but if we get hit in any capacity, we're going back?
The one word I had used to me was that the Israelis would take a minor hit, and I never have been able to learn what a minor hit is. I'm not sure if it was ever defined adequately for the American side. I think obviously the threshold, as we've been saying all evening, included a chemical or nerve gas hit, and that apparently has not happened. So I think from the American side, U.S. officials will be arguing that what Israel endured tonight, while outrageous and while George Bush condemned it in strong language tonight, issuing a statement from the White House, it still isn't enough for the Israelis to go in themselves. And of course, the United States has gone in there, as Fred Francis has reported. We're going after these missile sites. And apparently, from the wording of the communique out of the White House, the British must have too, because it said coalition forces. And of course, it's U.S. and British pilots who are doing the fighting so far, Tom.
Thank you very much. John Cochran at the White House tonight. NBC News, complete and uninterrupted coverage of America at War. Operation Desert Storm will continue right after this.
The humanity and understanding of America's Arab friends, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Syria, whether they will recognize Israel's fundamental right of self-defense to strike now in order to avoid being hit again in the future, or whether they'll tear the alliance apart. But if Israel strikes at this point, it will be a preventive measure to deter any future attacks against the civilian populations.
Rabbi Saperstein, what kind of an effective damage could they do? It would be mostly a symbolic strike, wouldn't it?
It could be, unless they have pinpointed some of the remaining mobile missiles.
I'm sorry, Rabbi Saperstein, we're going to break away there. We want to go now to hear from the Israeli ambassador to the United States. He may have additional clues for us.
In this auditorium, which we usually reserve for cultural events, I have to make the announcement that tonight, Washington time, during the night in Israel, there has been an unprovoked attack by Iraq, launching Scud missiles, or perhaps improved Scud missiles, at purely civilian targets in Israel, jeopardizing the lives of both Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians, who live next to each other, are often intermingled, and in a situation where Israel has time and time again declared that it is not part of the conflict with Iraq, it is not part of the coalition, and as a matter of fact, it has remained with a low profile, if you remember that term, for all these months, since the beginning of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. We don't have exact details as of yet. We understand that there's a possibility that more than 10 missiles were actually launched at Israel. Probably 2 hit the Tel Aviv area, and another one hit the Haifa area. There may have been another hit, but that is not clear as of yet. The missiles in the Tel Aviv area hit a neighborhood in the southern part of the city, inhabited mostly by elderly people and laborers, people who toil for their livelihood. We have so far, and we hope this is a final count, received information that there have been 6 or 7 injured, fortunately not seriously injured, but I don't know the exact details. And there has been considerable damage in property. among other things, because
coverage, but we do want to go now to the Pentagon, where NBC's Fred Francis is standing by. There has been only one American death in this operation so far, which is breathtaking and extraordinary given the scope of the military operation. Of course, that can be of no comfort whatsoever to the family of the American flyer who was killed in the initial bombing raids, and NBC's Fred Francis has more on that for us tonight. Fred?
Tom, the Pentagon officially lists Lieutenant Commander Michael S. Spiker of Jacksonville, Florida, as missing in action. However, his fellow pilots saw his aircraft blow up, over a target, we believe, inside Kuwait or southern Iraq. They say he is presumed dead, missing in action. Lieutenant Commander Michael Spiker, the first American killed in action, 33 years old, Tom, leaving a wife and 2 daughters in Jacksonville, Florida. He was off the USS Saratoga, the aircraft carrier. He was a pilot of an FA-18. That's a fighter attack bomber, the newest one in the United States Navy. And one hope was kept alive on Lieutenant Commander Michael Spiker for quite some time, some 10 hours today, because after his plane blew up, there was a strong emergency beacon that he had recovered, but they have determined that he has not, and he is officially listed as missing in action. Tom?
Fred, do we know anything more about those British flyers that were down after the sad news about the loss of an American flyer? There was some heartening news that the 2 British flyers were able to eject.
We were told that they ejected, and we were also told we don't want to talk about that, said a Pentagon official, just in case we might be able to rescue them.
All right, Fred Francis, thanks very much. Right now in Tel Aviv is Ehud Olmert, the Israeli health minister, a close advisor to Prime Minister Shamir. Is the Prime Minister up at this hour, Minister Olmert, and is he making a decision about what to do next?
Well, I can say that he's up. I can't tell you anything more about the deliberations process, but he's up from early morning.
Well, let me just put a proposition to you, that the damage was light. We know that it was innocent civilians that were hit, but they didn't take, there were no deaths. The wounding was not great. There were only 5 or 6 missiles altogether. You did expect a strike of some kind. The United States and its allies already have a massive bombing attack underway. Would it not be in Israel's best long-term interest to show prudence here and to show that it can be restrained?
Well, Tom, I certainly understand this point of view, and we heard this advice prior to the beginning of the
into Iraqi-held territory and take on the ground, Saddam Hussein's, the remnants, rather, after this area bombardments of Saddam Hussein's very formidable land force.
All right, Arthur Kent in Saudi Arabia, thank you. Let's go to the Pentagon now and get Fred Francis's input. Fred, you're listening to Arthur there in Saudi Arabia. Some units appear to be on the move. Do you have any indication from your point of view there in the Pentagon as to what this could mean?
Well, I can confirm what Arthur said. We are moving units. This country is moving units, but not in anticipating going over the line, as it were, and trying to punch a hole into the Iraqi defenses in Kuwait. They're moving units which were 40, 50 miles behind the lines all this time, pretty close to the front, just in case that is called for at the end of this bombing campaign. As Arthur said, the bombing campaign is expected to last 3 to 10 days. I would lead you to believe that it would last towards the latter 10 days, and I don't anticipate, based on everything I've learned here in the Pentagon today and yesterday, that the United States will begin a ground war until it has literally pounded every military target it could find, not just in Iraq, but seriously pound those military targets in Kuwait. They began that today, Garrick. They began B-52 bombing of the Republican Guards. That's the elite tank unit of Saddam's army. They began that pounding today. They also began these low-level air attacks with A-10 Warthogs, the tank killers, which are, I guess, 20 years old now, but very effective against tanks. They sent Apache helicopters, the latest version of the Army's tank-killing helicopters, into Kuwait to shoot at Iraqi tanks. So that all began today. Was it interrupted by the missile scare and the missiles into Saudi Arabia and Israel? It certainly was, but more emotionally than militarily. One senior military official told me earlier this evening, he said, we believe the coalition will hold together, the military coalition. He said, before we began all this, we laid out all these scenarios to the Syrians, to the Egyptians. What if Israel gets hit? How this could happen? And they laid them all out, and all of them said they would stay under all circumstances. And and finally, I would tell you, Garrick, that this same senior military official said, you must remember that while the end is not in doubt of this military action, that there are going to be days like this, that Saddam has a great many weapons at his disposal, not just missiles, but he has terrorism. He can destroy the oil fields in Kuwait. He can do a great many things. And while the end is not in doubt, there will be blips like this over the next several days. Garrick?
Well, Fred, you raised a point which piques my curiosity. As these bombing attacks continue, particularly the B-52 heavy carpet bombing against Iraqi positions in Kuwait, do we know whether Saddam Hussein, back there in Baghdad, probably several layers down in his well-fortified bunker, is able to get information as to what is happening to his forces there, or is he cut off? Because a key decision on the Iraqi part is whether Saddam knows what is happening to his troops in the field.
Well, we think he's cut off from those troops on the front line because one of the first targets hit yesterday, several hours into the campaign, were the Corps and Division headquarters occupying Kuwait. And those are the generals and the colonels who are in charge of the entire fortifications throughout Kuwait. So those headquarters were hit very severely, and their radios and communications facilities were hit severely. So he may not know what's going on in the front, and he's certainly not going to put any airplanes up to find out. And he may not be able to give any orders to the front. And that's what the United States tried to do initially, continues to do today, and will continue to do over the next several days, isolate those troops on the ground. Iraqi soldiers operate under the Soviet system. They need a great deal of centralized control, and without that centralized control, they hope the system degrades and that the Iraqi army degrades.
Fred Francis, the Pentagon, thank you. You mentioned how they operate under sort of Soviet tactical planning. Of course, the Soviets had a great influence there in terms of military strategy, also in terms of armaments. And today, the Soviet foreign minister made a speech in Moscow in which he talked about the war, the attacks against Baghdad and Iraq, and mentioned or raised a very sensitive issue for the Soviet government, the fact that the Iraqi air defense, which is basically a Soviet-built air defense, wasn't effective at all. And so the Soviet officials in Moscow went to great lengths to emphasize that the fault, indeed the fault which appeared to occur, was not in the hardware, the technology, but in the hands of the people, that is the Iraqis, who are operating the Soviet anti-air defenses. In other words, in the Moscow's or Kremlin's view, the problem is not in the equipment, it was in the Iraqis trying to handle it. Gary,